Countdown to Halloween 2022, featuring eerie and uncanny tales of haunts, ghosts, and suspense. Every Monday at exactly midnight, a new story will appear on Storylink Radio's YouTube channel as we count down to Halloween 2022. You will have 7 days to listen, then the next one will appear. Each story will be 13 to 30 minutes long. And now, tonight's story from Storylink Radio. The Steel Mirror, A Christmas Dream by W. Fenn. We have, most of us, at one time or other, had some experience in curious coincidences, mere matters of accident, which have fallen out so strangely as to wear the appearance of a forelaid scheme. Coincidences which have given rise in men's mind to the idea of destiny, fate, or whatever we may please to call it. Coincidences which, be they what they may, have without doubt been the basis of all superstition from time immemorial. Presentiments, in a measure, are common to everybody, and even the most matter-of-fact individual may occasionally be swayed by them in spite of himself. Now, I flattered myself that I was one of these same individuals. I laid claim to no superfluous imaginations and fancies. I was no believer in ghosts or spirit rapping, and yet uh, I leave it for others to judge whether what I'm about to tell is or is not to be accounted for by purely natural laws, worked out by a chance combination of time and place and circumstances. Ever since I can remember, it had been our habit to spend Christmas with our old friends at the Sequins, generally at their seat called the Bower, not far from the principal town of a celebrated hunting county, about 100 miles from London. It was a picturesque and a thorough specimen of a time-honored manor house, with scarcely a room, corridor, or passage that had not a legend of some kind attached to it. The family, too, was one of the most ancient in England, and many were the tales connected with the daring deeds performed and the knightly prowess displayed by its ancestors. My own father and old Sir George Sequin were contemporaries, and had religiously kept the custom, which I believe had been even handed down to them by their fathers, of always dining together on Christmas Day. It was from them Godfrey Sequin and I had again inherited the idea that things would go extremely wrong if the festive season was not spent in each other's company. Godfrey particularly had strong opinions on this point, and his anxiety that nothing should interfere with the custom sometimes bordered upon the superstitious. Heirs to the jovial and kindly feelings of our fathers, we had carefully maintained this principle. But as long ago my circumstances had so far changed as to render it impossible for me to entertain Godfrey and his wife in anything like their own style of living. The hospitality had been all on his side, and it had become a settled plan that we should go down to the Bower for a fortnight every Christmas. Now I had been married some few years when, just before one of these much looked forward to expeditions, my wife was taken suddenly, but not dangerously ill, and there seemed every probability of our good old custom being broken through for the first time. The doctors pronounced it madness for her to think of taking a journey in the state of health she then was in. Letters passed to and fro between the Bower and Bloomsbury Square. Devices and suggestions for surmounting the difficulty arose on both sides. I was to go with one of my girls, the other to remain with her mother. Sir Godfrey and Lady Sequin were to come to us. Some plan must be adopted, if possible, to prevent our being separated at Christmas. Now, I did not myself feel the absolute necessity of this, but the Sequins held strong opinions about it, and, well, it would be terribly unlucky. We ought not to break through the rule whilst there was the slightest chance of maintaining it. Godfrey was even more urgent than his wife, and his letters had in them almost an imploring tone, bespeaking, as I fancied, an over-anxiety and fear that something dire might happen if I failed to occupy my usual seat at his Christmas table. Well, affairs remained in this uncertain state until, within a few days of the 25th of December, when my wife, having somewhat recovered, settled the difficulty by deciding, with that combined spirit of self-sacrifice and determination which some women display in emergencies, that considering Godfrey's earnest wish, I ought to go down alone for, well, a day or two at least. Her kind heart at once led her to set aside all her own feelings on the matter. She could not bear to think that my friend's happiness should be interfered with by any dislike she might feel at being left alone at such a time. She said that she should become quite superstitious herself if she were to cause the breach of this old established custom. After all, she continued, what is it but a few days' absence? I should think nothing of it in any other season, and it is only imagination which leads one to attribute more importance to it just now. And I, have very little imagination, love. Whilst your friend Godfrey and his wife are made of it. Reluctantly, then, I just settled to go. I say reluctantly. For the moment I had consented, a strange and unusual feeling of depression came upon me. I could not but admit the common sense of my wife's words, but nevertheless to me, ridiculous foreboding of evil, almost as though I sensed a disquieting metamorphosis, or at the least a sense of discomfort rooted itself in my mind. Apart from the joviality of Christmas meetings, I was the last person in the world to attribute any serious importance to their not being kept up. Still, I failed to get over the disquiet which the present arrangement had created. However, I bade my wife and my girls goodbye on the 23rd, determining that as Christmas Day fell on the Wednesday, to return at the end of the week instead of remaining as usual for the customary program of hunting and shooting, etc. On my way down, everything seemed to combine to lower my spirits, the only other occupants of the railway carriage being a young widow lady and her two little children. Her grief was very fresh, and it was with the greatest difficulty once or twice that she restrained herself from hysterical paroxysms of tears. The weather, too, was muggy and gloomy. Thick mists had settled determinedly over all parts of the flat country through which my journey lay. Do what I could not help contrasting the present state of the atmosphere with the crisp, frosty brightness and invigorating air which I remembered had set my usually elastic disposition bounding like a child's when I traveled over the same ground a year ago. The hearty welcome at the Bower only temporarily dismissed this demon of disquiet from my elbow, and I was so continually relapsed into silence during the dinner that two or three of my old friends assembled at the house, and Godfrey especially noticed my dejection, but dealt lightly with it, as of course my wife's absence, being universally regretted, at the same time also accounted for my own unwonted demeanor. The mirth generally, for some reason, was not as great as struck me as on previous occasions. The following day, which was Christmas Eve, we were still very dull, my own feelings considerably worse. I had grown horribly anxious, for the Morning Post had brought no letter from my wife, although she had promised to write a line in the afternoon of the day I started. There was really nothing in this circumstance, yet somehow or other I was so unhinged that it had an effect upon me quite inconsistent with its importance. There were no means by which my mind could be speedily set at rest, for these were the early days of electric telegraphy, and the system of communication was very incomplete. Dankborough, the county town, was as yet without wires, and we were 40 miles from the nearest telegraph station. The arguments of Lady Sequin and her husband all failed to rouse and cheer me up, and in the most unnatural way my dejection rather communicated itself to them, for they began to feel that perhaps it had been a little selfish on their part to insist on my presence under the circumstances. It was the most dismal Christmas Eve we could remember. We voted it so by acclamation, vainly endeavoring to extract a joke from our universal opinion. On retiring for the night, my condition of mind, far from improving, became so deplorable that I thought I was losing my senses or going to have a serious illness. The picturesque, old-fashioned room allotted to me, called the Mirror Chamber, was, I knew, noted in the annals of the house for several legends attached to it. None of these, however, lived individually in my mind, but highly wrought as it then was, this recollection communicated an uncanny and ghostly appearance to the place. which it would not have borne, indeed, which it had never borne to me on ordinary occasions. In my present morbidly unhealthy state, it required a great effort to put out my candle and turn into bed. After this was so accomplished, the flickering light of the fire at times became so distressing that I could not persuade myself that I was alone in that room. I got out of bed. I undrew the curtains. I drew them back again. I shifted the furniture, and I generally worked myself into such a state of fever that I quite lost all self-command, although at the same time feeling perfectly ashamed of the weak, unmanly part I was playing. Back again in my bed, I tossed and tumbled from side to side, and when at last worn out, I did begin to doze. The moaning of the wind at the casement, or the soft lapping sound of the dying embers falling upon the hearth, disturbed me with a start and a shock which vibrated through my frame as if there had been an earthquake. I don't know how long I had been asleep, if asleep I really was, and this is the point which will ever remain a mystery in my mind. when when a dream of such terrible reality came upon me, that to forget it, or indeed to believe that it was a dream, is next to impossible. At any rate, I was conscious of my exact position, conscious of the unnatural state of my mind, conscious of how and where I was lying flat on my back, staring straight through the aperture between the curtains at the foot of my bed, conscious that I saw the bed dimly reflected in that relic of antiquity, a steel mirror hanging opposite. Now, if I was in a dream, I was dreaming that I was awake, and awake in precisely the same place under the same circumstances in which I knew myself to be. The same thoughts, the same feelings, the same surroundings were as vividly reproduced as any events in the most startling dreams ever are. The only difference being that instead of dreaming of remote affairs and conditions, I was dreaming of the present, the positive, tangible present. Here then I was lying, asleep or awake, as you please, when I became aware of a dim mist gradually overspreading that mirror, such as might be produced by human breath, increasing now, and then decreasing, just as if the action of the lungs in respiration made it fluctuate. This effect had continued for a minute or more, when I observed the reflected palm of a stealthy hand passed, as it were, straight across the steel, as though to wipe away the obscuring vapor, and then I saw upon the now unclouded metal a face. Not the face itself, but palpably the reflex of one, as you may see our own in any glass. It appeared to be gazing at its eyes, yet there was no intervening form, no figure visible of which I felt certain this vision was but a reproduction. Starting upright in bed, convulsively clutching the clothes, and whilst cold drops of perspiration broke out upon my forehead and my tongue clove to the roof of my mouth, I remained horror-stricken, for the face hitherto unrecognizable now clearly showed itself to be that of a woman, the head and cheeks partially enveloped in something white, rapidly increasing in the distinctness. The white head covering grew into the similitude of widow's weeds, as was worn a few centuries ago, and the features, great powers! I shudder as I recall my sensations, plainly and unmistakably assumed the form of those of my own wife. The terrible truth of the likeness was made more manifest for a while, as the shape seemed to draw nearer. A spurt of flame at the same time springing brightly from the grate showed the apparition with startling vividness. It was the last spark of light in the fire, which, burning brightly for one moment, instantly afterwards disappeared, leaving the room in total darkness. I fell back in a swoon, from which I only slowly recovered as the dreary morning light was creeping through the shutters. Paralyzed though I was by a multitude of bewildering sensations, I at last managed to dress myself and hasten downstairs, firmly resolving that if the post brought no reassuring news from home, that I would go back to town immediately. It would be mere mockery attempting to enter into Christmas festivities under this roof. I knew, from her active habits, that I should find Lady Sequin astir before anyone else, and I went straight to her morning room to communicate my intentions. She was unlocking the letter bag as I entered, and her surprise at my early visit gave way, the moment she looked in my face, to a suppressed ejaculation of fear. "Oh, what is the matter?" she exclaimed. You are as pale as a ghost. Are you ill? Yes, I think I am, dear Lady Sequin, I replied. But pray tell me, is there a letter from my Maria? We ran over the contents of the bag together. No, there was nothing for me. Then taking her hand, I continued, I must have the dog cart round at once to catch the next train for London. Going back? And today? What for? Why, Godfrey will never forgive you. I can't help it. I dare say it's very foolish, but you know the uncomfortable circumstance under which I came to you. You must have seen how distressed I have been for the last 24 hours. There is still no letter for me, and I cannot, after what I went through last night, endure this uncertainty any longer. Something has happened, or will happen, if I don't return at once. Gone through? And what have you gone through? Why, such a night as I trust I may never pass again. And then, as the best means of explaining my reasons for leaving, I detailed my sensations, and the revelation of the mirror, adding my conviction that dream or reality was a warning which I could not neglect. As she listened, a shade gradually fell over her sunny countenance, and she gazed at me as earnestly as if she would catch the sense of my words before they fell from my lips. When I spoke of the widow's weeds, she sank half fainting into a chair. A moment afterwards, raising herself with an effort, and looking up with eyes full of dreary abstraction, she said, "Oh, have have no fear, my friend. Have no fear. Do not leave us. It is not. It is not to you, but no, no, no. You never saw this. You dreamed it. Your heart was filled with thoughts of your wife. You fancied. You knew not what. You are not well. Uh, I have read that this." And then checking herself, she continued, but why should you go? Pray, do not leave us now." Well, I admit that I was moved beyond expression by the piteous sadness of her face. But still, with the horror of the night fresh in my mind, I felt that depart I must. It was with a choked utterance that I repeated my decision, adding, I know that the trains run today as on Sundays, and I shall have time to catch the parliamentary. Say anything for me you will. Make any excuse you like. Tell Godfrey that I've lost my senses. Tell him what I have seen. I don't care. Tell Godfrey? She almost screamed, springing to her feet, seizing my arm. Tell him? No, not for the world. And her face flushed with excitement, and her eyes gleamed. Breathe not a word of this either to him. Should you see him before you start, or to any living soul, give any reason for your departure rather than this. If friendship is not a mere word, promise me not to speak of it. Oh, promise me, promise me. The extraordinary vehemence and agony of her manner caused a strange revulsion of feeling in me. Why did she so earnestly implore silence? Promise. Of course I would, but still I was determined to return home. Well, God bless you, dear Lady Sequin, I said. I would do all and everything for you and Godfrey, but my wife, I must satisfy myself that no harm has come to her. Goodbye at once, goodbye, or I shall be too late. Leaving her with her face buried in her hands, I hastened out of the room. An hour afterwards, without having seen Godfrey or any of the other guests, I was steaming towards London, my heart and mind busy with bewildering conjectures. How strange that my narration should so have affected my old friend's wife. Why should it have moved her so strongly? And what an agonized look she gave as she saw me drive away. The features reflected in the mirror were plainly those of Maria. To me, and mine alone, could there have been any meaning in what I had seen? How was it all to be accounted for? I knew not what to think, and it was only when I afterwards became acquainted with the legend attached to that steel mirror that the mystery was finally solved for me. Occupied by conflicting thoughts, giddy with suspense, I at last reached town after the terrible delays attending upon a slow parliamentary train, and it was late ere I rattled through the quiet streets of Bloomsbury in the dusky twilight of the winter afternoon. The relief which followed the surprised but reassuring words uttered by the servant as she let me into the house was perhaps the most pleasurable sensation I have ever experienced in my life. Nothing the matter? No, of course not. Everything remained as I had left it. If there was a change, my wife was a little better, but startled beyond expression at seeing me. A few words explained all. Certainly Maria had written, not on the day I left, but the day after, that is, yesterday, and I ought to have received a letter this morning, the morning of this identical Christmas day. The servant had posted it in good time, had she not? No, that was just what she had not done, for upon inquiry she admitted that it might have been a little past 6 before she got to the post office. Mightily rallied was I by the madam and her daughters for a dear superstitious old idiot. For remembering my promise to Lady Sequin, I did not tell them the cause which had mainly induced my return. I could simply attribute it to the want of news and a general apprehension of evil which possessed me. I spent a most unlooked for, but not exactly merry Christmas evening, for great as was my relief, I found it impossible quite to recover myself or banish from my mind the remembrance of the extraordinary effect my narration and consequent departure had had upon Lady Sequin. Poor Godfrey, too, how disappointed he would be, disappointed in the very thing upon which he had set his heart and pinned his faith, unaccustomed likewise to ghostly influences. I felt it would take a day or two to shake them off. Aye, indeed, I might well think so. For even now I doubt whether they can ever disappear. On Saturday, the third morning after my return, whilst looking for an answer to a note I had dispatched to Godfrey immediately upon my reaching home, stating how groundless I found my fears to have been, and proposing to retrieve my lost character by again going down to the Bower, a letter in handwriting which I knew to be that of one of our great friends, a never-failing Christmas guest of the sequence. As a letter was put into my hands. Its place is here. The Bower, Bankborough, December 27. I have undertaken to break to you as gently as may be the details of the affairs here since you so suddenly and unexpectedly left us on Christmas Day. Our good host could not recover your absence and advised strongly against what he called your extraordinary and inexplicable behavior. Throughout the day he hopped upon it, and not having been quite himself lately, as I think we may all have observed it, he did not take it so easily as he otherwise would. At dinner, too, he was more strong on the point than ever. There were a lot of our usual friends here, and whilst talking of you, he suddenly began to count their number, exclaiming, "Oh, bless my heart, if his absence does not make us 13 at this table." And from that moment all semblance of good spirits deserted him. Lady Sequin likewise seemed affected by some mysterious influence, and was far from well. The result, my friend, was the most dismal Christmas day I have ever known in this house. Prepare yourself, my dear fellow, to bear up against what I know will be a terrible shock to you. The following day, poor Godfrey, with some half-dozen of us, rode over to Dankborough. Coming home, it was proposed that we should make a short cut across the country, and off we went, rather glad of something to stir us up and make a brisk finish of it. The speed in our spirits gradually increased. One or two raspers were taken with great success by Sequin on a hunter he was trying for the first time. The brute had gone well so far, but in coming to a double post and rail, a rather narrow in and out, and taking his second rise, rather missing his distance or landing awkwardly, no one knows exactly how, he fell, rolling over all, we suppose, upon Godfrey. For when we went back to the place, the horse was standing shivering with fear, and Godfrey lay stretched motionless on the ground, never, alas, to move again. We carried him home, and then his poor wife. And I know that your eyes will be dim when you come to this part of my letter, as mine are now whilst I write it to you. Lady Sequin never did recover from the shock. Her brain became partially affected. She had intervals, however, of perfect sanity, and it was in one of these, shortly before her death, she sent for me. Our interview was the most painful I've ever gone through. The result of it was a communication she made to me, and the purport of which ends my little tale. It appeared that only a few days before this fatal Christmas, she and her poor husband had come upon some hitherto undiscovered papers in the secret drawer of an old cabinet. Amongst several anecdotes and records of the Sequin family, there was one which they read together, and which took great hold of the imaginations of both. The story ran, that such a vision as I had seen in the steel mirror, The ghostly reflection of a widowed woman only appeared when a violent death threatened the head of the sequin house. Its last coming was in 1746, when it had been immediately followed by the death of the first Sir Godfrey on the battlefield of Culloden. Many previous instances were also recorded of his appearance, always with the same result. You've just heard tonight's story from Storylink Radio's Countdown to Halloween 2022. Remember to come back for our next tale. Many more stories of all genres available to listen to and read along with now on our website at www.storylinkradio.com. Visit our YouTube channel at youtube.com/StorylinkRadio. And visit our podcast for easy mobile listening anywhere, anytime. Just search for Storylink Radio on your favorite podcast provider. Oh, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button and click that alert bell for Storylink Radio.